Welcome to Warriors of the World. Today we'll be exploring the life and legacy of Sun Tzu, history's most influential military strategist, whose work, The Art of War, continues to shape strategic thinking 2,500 years after it was written. Subscribe now to join our community and support this project. Now, let's begin. China, 6th century BC. A turbulent period known as the Warring States era. While 7 kingdoms fought for supremacy across a war-torn land, a military mind emerged who would forever revolutionize the art of strategy. Sun Tzu, whose birth name was Sun Wu, was born around 544 BC in the state of Qi, in what would now be Shandong province. Although details of his early life remain shrouded in historical mist, we know he belonged to an aristocratic class of warrior scholars typical of ancient China. Like many nobles of his time, Sun Tzu studied Confucian classics, poetry, astronomy, and mathematics, but his genius found expression on the battlefield. What fascinates historians about Sun Tzu is that unlike many great generals throughout history, his greatness doesn't primarily lie in his personal military victories but in his ability to develop a complete system of strategic thought. His reputation reached the ears of King Helu of Wu, who summoned him to demonstrate his military knowledge. The legend, recorded by historian Sima Qian, tells how the king asked Sun Tzu to prove his theories by training 180 royal concubines as soldiers. When they failed to follow orders, Sun Tzu executed the 2 concubine leaders, despite them being the king's favorites. This brutal act conveyed a clear message: military discipline transcends personal connections and feelings. Impressed by his determination, the king granted him command of his armies. As military historian Dr. Richard Gabriel noted, Sun Tzu understood that warfare wasn't a matter of personal valor or brute force but of methodology, psychology, and systematic strategy. In a world of warriors seeking personal glory, he introduced the revolutionary concept that the best victory is one achieved without fighting. This understanding would lead Sun Tzu to create not just military doctrine, but an entire philosophy of conflict that would influence fields far beyond the battlefield. His approach, intellectual, calculating, and holistic, stands in stark contrast to the Western tradition established by figures like Alexander the Great, who led from the front in bloody personal combat. In Sun Tzu, we find perhaps history's first true strategist in the modern sense of the word. Imagine a text so powerful that, after 2.5 millennia, it remains required reading in military academies, business schools, and universities worldwide. The Art of War isn't just history's oldest and most influential military treatise. It's a work that transcends its original purpose to become a universal guide to strategy. The text we know today was compiled during the Han Dynasty, 206 BC, 220 AD, but its content reflects Sun Tzu's original teachings, first transmitted orally and later documented by his disciples. Structured in 13 concise chapters, each dedicated to a fundamental aspect of strategy, the text addresses topics ranging from planning and tactics to espionage and terrain management. The brilliance of The Art of War lies in its economy of language. With just 6,000 Chinese characters, Sun Tzu managed to condense strategic principles so universal they apply to armed conflicts, business competition, sports contests, and even personal relationships. Its aphoristic style, with phrases like, "Know your enemy and know yourself. In 100 battles, you will never be defeated," facilitates memorization and application. For centuries, the text was considered a state secret in China. Emperors guarded it jealously, aware that its knowledge conferred an incalculable advantage. It wasn't until the 18th century that the text reached the West, first translated into French and then into other European languages, causing a revolution in Western strategic thinking. As Harvard professor Joseph Nye observed, what makes The Art of War timeless is that it doesn't focus on specific weapons or tactics, which inevitably become obsolete, but on the psychological and strategic fundamentals that remain constant across time and technology. The archaeological excavations at Yingxin in 1972 discovered fragments of The Art of War on bamboo slips dated around 140 BC, confirming its historical authenticity. This finding demonstrated that Sun Tzu's teachings had remained remarkably consistent through the centuries, testament to their conceptual clarity and enduring practical value. Unlike Western military classics that can run hundreds of pages with detailed tactical prescriptions, Sun Tzu's masterpiece achieves its impact through brevity and adaptability. Its principles, so fundamental they appear almost obvious today, represented a radical departure from the battlefield practices of his era. It wasn't just a manual but a complete reconceptualization of conflict itself. Before Sun Tzu, Warfare in ancient China was often a ritualized affair where massive armies directly clashed in bloody pitched battles. Commanders sought personal glory, and individual valor was valued above strategy. Sun Tzu radically transformed this vision, introducing revolutionary concepts that would forever change military thinking. His most profound innovation was his emphasis on winning without fighting. "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting," he wrote. This concept was revolutionary in an era when victory was typically measured in blood spilled and territory conquered. Sun Tzu proposed that the most successful war was one in which political objectives were achieved through deterrence, deception, psychological manipulation, and diplomacy, reserving combat as a last resort. Another transformative principle was his insistence on knowledge as the foundation of military success. "If you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles," he stated. Sun Tzu dedicated an entire chapter to espionage, considering it not a complement but a central element of strategy. While other generals relied on momentary inspiration, he advocated for a systematic approach based on accurate information. His concept of sure, strategic advantage represented another revolution. Sun Tzu compared warfare to water flowing downhill, suggesting that the wise strategist doesn't fight against circumstances but exploits them, channeling existing forces rather than creating them. This energetic vision of strategy radically contrasted with the Western approach centered on imposing will through brute force. Perhaps his most enduring contribution was integrating psychological factors into military strategy. "All warfare is based on deception," he declared, emphasizing the manipulation of enemy perceptions. Centuries before Clausewitz spoke of the fog of war, Sun Tzu had already developed sophisticated techniques to exploit the uncertainty inherent in conflict. As Colonel John Warden, architect of the Desert Storm Air Campaign, noted, Sun Tzu's greatest insight was recognizing that the mind of the enemy command was the real center of gravity in any conflict. Affect the enemy's thinking, and you control his actions without necessarily destroying his forces. This psychological emphasis stands in stark contrast to the Western military tradition epitomized by Clausewitz's focus on decisive battle. Where European strategists traditionally sought the destruction of enemy forces, Sun Tzu sought to render such destruction unnecessary through superior strategy, an approach that would find modern expression in concepts like information warfare and effects-based operations. Although historical sources about specific campaigns directed by Sun Tzu are limited, Sima Qian's historical records and other ancient chronicles allow us to reconstruct his impressive military career serving the Kingdom of Wu between approximately 512 and 496 BC. His first major test came when King Helu of Wu appointed him commander to face the powerful state of Chu, then the main military power in the region. Chu had an army 5 times larger than Wu's, and conventional logic would have dictated avoiding confrontation. However, Sun Tzu saw opportunity where others saw disaster. Applying his principles, Sun Tzu conducted an exhaustive analysis of Chu's strengths and weaknesses, discovering that despite its size, the enemy army suffered from coordination problems among its generals. Avoiding direct confrontation, he directed a series of rapid attacks against strategic points, forcing Chu's generals to divide their forces. When he finally provoked a battle at Boju, 506 BC, he had neutralized the enemy's numerical advantage and created favorable conditions that resulted in a decisive victory. This campaign exemplified his principle of attacking the enemy's strategy. Rather than confronting Chu's troops directly, Sun Tzu attacked their plans, creating confusion and internal divisions that weakened their effectiveness before any direct confrontation. Another notable campaign was against the state of Yu, where Sun Tzu employed elaborate intelligence operations. By infiltrating spies into the enemy court, he obtained information about their defenses and planted rumors that induced Yu's king to fortify the wrong points. When the attack came, Yu's main defenses were protecting secondary areas while their vital points remained vulnerable. Most impressively, Sun Tzu achieved many of these victories without large pitched battles. As British military historian B. H. Liddell Hart would observe thousands of years later, Sun Tzu pioneered what we now call the indirect approach to warfare, striking where the enemy is least prepared rather than where they are strongest. Sun Tzu's preference for maneuver over direct confrontation would influence generations of commanders, from Byzantine General Belisarius to Confederate cavalry leader Nathan Bedford Forrest, who intuitively followed Sun Tzu's advice to march by unusual routes and strike at unexpected times. But perhaps his most dedicated student was the 20th century Chinese revolutionary leader Mao Zedong, who applied Sun Tzu's principles of deception, flexibility, and attacking vulnerabilities to defeat both Japanese invaders and Chinese nationalist forces despite significant disadvantages in equipment and numbers. War is a matter of vital importance to the state, the province of life or death, the road to survival or ruin. It is mandatory that it be thoroughly studied. With these words, Sun Tzu begins The Art of War, immediately establishing that military strategy cannot be left to improvisation or intuition but must be approached as a rigorous science. The core of his scientific system are the 5 factors that every commander must meticulously evaluate: the Tao, political and moral leadership; heaven, weather and temporal conditions; earth, geography and terrain; the general, skills and character of the commander; and method, discipline, organization, and logistics. The revolutionary aspect of this approach is its systematization of strategic analysis. While other military treatises of the time focused on technical aspects like formations or weaponry, Sun Tzu created a comprehensive analytical framework for evaluating every military situation. For him, victory wasn't a matter of luck or brute force but the predictable result of a correct calculation of these 5 factors. In practice, this meant that before any campaign, Sun Tzu conducted an exhaustive analysis. He evaluated the soundness of political leadership, Tao, studied weather patterns that could affect troop movements, heaven, analyzed the topography of the battlefield in detail, earth, honestly assessed his own strengths and weaknesses as a commander, general, and ensured his troops were well organized and provisioned, method. This scientific approach allowed him to identify what we would now call asymmetric advantages, factors that, although seemingly secondary, could be decisive in the right context. For example, in his campaign against Chu, he identified that the enemy's heavy war chariots, generally an advantage, would become a disadvantage in marshy terrain, so he directed the battle toward areas where the ground was soft. Sun Tzu formulated his method with mathematical precision. The general who makes a proper assessment in his temple before the battle has greater chances of winning. This emphasis on prior calculation contrasts with the Western glorification of improvisation on the battlefield. For Sun Tzu, if the commander needed to improvise extensively during battle, he had already failed in his preparation. American military theorist Colonel John Boyd, creator of the OODA loop decision cycle, acknowledged his debt to Sun Tzu, noting, "The 5 factors framework represents history's first systematic attempt to break warfare down into analyzable components." What's remarkable is how little has fundamentally changed. Modern military planners still evaluate politics, weather, terrain, leadership, and logistics, just as Sun Tzu prescribed 2,500 years ago. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This maxim reflects perhaps Sun Tzu's most sophisticated contribution, his deep understanding of the psychological dimension of conflict. Centuries before psychology existed as a discipline, Sun Tzu developed advanced techniques to manipulate the adversary's perceptions, emotions, and decision-making processes. For him, psychological warfare wasn't a complement to military operations but their most important dimension. His approach began with disinformation. When capable, feign incapacity. When active, feign inactivity, he advised. This principle manifested in elaborate schemes to project a calculated image to the enemy. During his campaign against the state of Qi, for example, Sun Tzu ordered fewer campfires to be lit each night, creating the impression of mass desertions. When the enemy attacked confidently, they fell into a perfectly planned ambush. Another fundamental aspect was manipulating the enemy commander's emotions. "If your opponent is of choleric temper, seek to irritate him," he wrote. Sun Tzu meticulously studied the personality of rival generals, designing specific operations to provoke emotional reactions that would cloud their judgment. When facing a general known for his impatience, he established a series of small skirmishes followed by retreats, frustrating him until he abandoned his defensive positions in a reckless attack. Creating impossible dilemmas constituted another advanced psychological technique. When you surround an enemy, leave an outlet. Do not press a desperate enemy too hard, he advised. This apparent contradiction hides a profound psychological wisdom. An adversary without hope will fight to the death, while one with an apparent escape route can be led precisely where the strategist desires. Former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert Gates once remarked, "Sun Tzu understood something fundamental about human psychology that modern behavioral economics is only now rediscovering, that people rarely make decisions based purely on rational calculation but are profoundly influenced by cognitive biases, emotional states, and perceived options." This psychological sophistication found its clearest expression in Sun Tzu's famous dictum that all warfare is based on deception. While Western military tradition often emphasized principles like mass, concentration of force, and direct action, Sun Tzu emphasized that these physical factors were secondary to psychological factors. The battle was won or lost in the mind before a single soldier engaged in combat. Modern military operations that emphasize information warfare, perception management, and psychological operations, PSYOPs, are direct descendants of Sun Tzu's approach. As one senior PSYOPs officer noted during operations in Iraq, "We're not doing anything that Sun Tzu wouldn't recognize, we're just doing it with modern technology." Just as water retains no constant shape, in warfare there are no constant conditions. With this hydraulic metaphor, Sun Tzu introduces one of his most revolutionary concepts: strategic adaptability based on terrain conditions. Unlike other military treatises that prescribed fixed formations and tactics, Sun Tzu insisted that each situation requires a unique approach, determined primarily by the nature of the terrain. He dedicated an entire chapter of The Art of War to classifying 9 types of terrain: dispersive, frontier, key, communicating, focal, serious, difficult, encircled, and deadly. Each type required a radically different approach. In dispersive terrain, where soldiers might easily desert to return home, he emphasized the mental unification of troops through shared objectives. In difficult, mountainous terrain, he recommended taking and holding strategic heights. In deadly terrain, where troops must fight or die, he advised eliminating all possibility of retreat to ensure soldiers fought with desperate determination. This systematic categorization of terrain represented a fundamental innovation. While his contemporaries saw terrain as a simple setting for battle, Sun Tzu conceived it as a dynamic actor in conflict, capable of multiplying or neutralizing combat power. "Know the terrain, know the weather, and your victory will be complete," he stated. His genius was evident in the campaign against the State of Yu, where he faced an army that exceeded his in a ratio of 3-1. Instead of seeking a frontal battle, Sun Tzu constantly maneuvered toward swampy and densely wooded terrain that neutralized the enemy's numerical advantage and hindered the coordination of their units. The result was a decisive victory with minimal losses. Modern military doctrine on terrain analysis owes a direct debt to Sun Tzu. When U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf planned Operation Desert Storm in 1991, his famous left hook maneuver through the desert to outflank Iraqi forces reflected Sun Tzu's principle of adapting to terrain, using the seemingly inhospitable desert as an avenue of approach precisely because the Iraqis considered it impassable. Sun Tzu's adaptability concept transcended the purely physical to encompass what we might call political terrain. He meticulously analyzed alliances, internal tensions, and political pressures affecting the enemy, adapting his strategy to exploit these non-physical vulnerabilities. As NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe General Wesley Clark observed, "What makes Sun Tzu so relevant to modern warfighting is his emphasis on adaptability. In an age of rapidly evolving technology and hybrid threats, his water metaphor perfectly captures the need for military forces to be flexible and responsive rather than rigid and doctrinaire." Although Sun Tzu revolutionized strategic thinking, his greatest achievement may have been creating a continuous school of military thought that endured long after his death. This school of Sun Tzu transformed strategy from a personal skill into a systematic discipline that could be taught and perfected generation after generation. The first and most prominent intellectual heir was Sun Bin, a purported descendant of Sun Tzu who lived during the Warring States period, approximately 2 centuries later. Sun Bin not only preserved his predecessor's teachings but expanded and adapted them to changing warfare conditions. His own treatise, Sun Bin's Art of War, rediscovered in archaeological excavations in 1972, complements and expands the original principles with practical examples and new tactics. The definitive proof of this school came during China's unification under the Qin dynasty. General Wang Jian, a declared student of Sun Tzu's principles, systematically defeated numerically superior armies of the state of Chu through the rigorous application of principles such as attack where the enemy is unprepared, appear where unexpected. His conquest of the powerful state of Chu in 223 BC demonstrated the enduring effectiveness of these methods. The school of Sun Tzu was institutionalized during the Han Dynasty, when The Art of War became required reading for military officers. Emperor Wu established a military academy specifically dedicated to the systematic study of strategic principles, with Sun Tzu's teachings as the core curriculum. Perhaps the most famous heir was Zhuge Liang, the legendary strategist of the Three Kingdoms period, 220 to 280 AD. Known as the Sleeping Dragon, Zhuge Liang employed Sun Tzu's principles to compensate for the numerical inferiority of the Shu kingdom. His famous Battle of Red Cliffs and the empty fort strategy exemplify the creative application of principles such as, when you are strong, appear weak; when you are weak, appear strong. The influence of this strategic lineage extended beyond China's borders. In Japan, the samurai class adopted many of Sun Tzu's principles, with the legendary shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu being an avowed student. His application of principles like winning without fighting allowed him to unify Japan after the Sengoku period with minimal bloodshed. American military historian Edward Luttwak points out, "What's remarkable about the school of Sun Tzu is that unlike many military traditions that became hidebound and ritualistic, it maintained its innovative edge by focusing on principles rather than prescribed actions." From the Han Dynasty to modern PLA doctrine, each generation has renewed these teachings, demonstrating that their value lies not in specific prescriptions but in fundamental principles that can be endlessly adapted. Sun Tzu's strategic thinking remained a closely guarded secret in Asia for centuries. While the West developed its own military tradition based on frontal principles of mass and firepower, Sun Tzu's subtle strategic art was unknown beyond Eastern borders. This would dramatically change starting in the 18th century, initiating an intellectual conquest that continues to this day. The art of war first reached the West in 1772, when French Jesuit Joseph-Marie Amiot translated the text into French. Although initially received as an Oriental curiosity, the treatise gradually caught the attention of European military circles. Napoleon Bonaparte, always eager for military knowledge, studied this translation, and although he publicly favored more direct approaches, several of his flanking and deception maneuvers show clear influences of Sun Tzu's thinking. The true revelation for the West came during World War II, when Allied officers faced Japanese strategists deeply influenced by Sun Tzu. The Japanese ability to achieve surprise victories with limited resources, exemplified at Pearl Harbor, demonstrated the practical effectiveness of principles such as speed is the essence of war and attack where the enemy is unprepared. This lesson wasn't lost on Cold War Western strategists. In the United States, the military academy at West Point incorporated the art of war into its curriculum in 1957. General Douglas MacArthur was an avowed scholar of the text, frequently citing it in his memoirs and applying its principles in the Korean War, particularly in the bold Incheon landing that, as Sun Tzu would have approved, appeared where the enemy didn't expect it. The Vietnam War provided another striking example of Sun Tzu's principles in action. North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap meticulously applied the principle of avoiding strengths, attacking weaknesses, avoiding direct confrontations with superior American firepower while striking vulnerable targets. Henry Kissinger would later acknowledge, "The Americans fought the war with Clausewitz's principles, the North Vietnamese with Sun Tzu's." It eventually became apparent whose approach was more suitable to the conflict. The true global explosion of Sun Tzu came in the 1980s, when the text transcended the military realm to conquer the business world. With Samuel B. Griffith's translation and subsequently James Clavell's version, The Art of War became required reading in business schools. Japanese executives had silently applied these principles for decades. Now the West discovered their value for corporate competition. As former General Electric CEO Jack Welch noted, business is competitive warfare. Whether you're attacking a competitor or defending market share, Sun Tzu's principles on preparation, knowledge of terrain, and indirect approach are directly applicable to modern business strategy. Today, from Middle Eastern battlefields to Wall Street boardrooms, from Russian military academies to Brazilian business schools, Sun Tzu's principles have achieved a universality that transcends cultures and disciplines, confirming his status as history's most influential strategist. In a world where military technology constantly changes, from autonomous drones to cyber warfare, it's astonishing that a text written 2,500 years ago continues to offer relevant lessons. However, Sun Tzu's endurance lies precisely in the fact that his principles transcend specific technologies to address fundamental constants of human conflict. The first lesson for our time is his emphasis on victory without battle. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the acme of skill, wrote Sun Tzu. In the nuclear age, where direct confrontation between superpowers could mean mutual destruction, this philosophy has gained new urgency. The Cold War was primarily won through economic pressure, psychological warfare, and proxy conflicts, exactly the type of indirect victory Sun Tzu would have recommended. His insistence on quality information, know your enemy and know yourself, resonates powerfully in our age of information overload. As governments and companies navigate oceans of data, Sun Tzu reminds us that information only has value when transformed into actionable knowledge. Modern intelligence agencies, from the CIA to Mossad, remain organized according to principles Sun Tzu would recognize, with emphasis on human intelligence, humant, that provides context and meaning to technical data. Sun Tzu's concept of asymmetric warfare has acquired new relevance in contemporary conflicts. His teachings on how smaller forces can defeat more powerful adversaries by exploiting specific vulnerabilities are reflected in conflicts from Afghanistan to Ukraine. As former Secretary of Defense James Mattis noted, the fundamental nature of war hasn't changed in 2,500 years. Sun Tzu's precepts about knowing your enemy, avoiding enemy strengths, and attacking vulnerabilities remain as valid in the age of hypersonic missiles as they were in the age of crossbows. In the business realm, his insistence on meticulous preparation and market knowledge has guided successful corporate strategies. Companies from Amazon to Toyota have explicitly applied Sun Tzu's principles in their global expansion, demonstrating that understanding the market, terrain, and competitors' tactics remains as vital in boardrooms as on battlefields. Even in cybersecurity, Sun Tzu's concepts of deception, terrain, and indirect attack inform contemporary strategies. Digital honeypots, where false targets are created to attract and study attacks, are modern applications of his principle: appear weak when you are strong. Perhaps the deepest lesson for our turbulent times is Sun Tzu's call for balanced strategic reflection. In a world of 24-hour news cycles, instant reactions, and increasingly shorter planning horizons, his insistence on deep thinking and patient consideration of multiple factors offers a necessary counterweight to our culture of immediacy. As Harvard strategist Joseph Nye expressed, Sun Tzu reminds us that true strategy isn't about reacting to chaos but understanding underlying patterns and acting with precision at the right moment. In a world where brute force continues to dominate international discourse, Sun Tzu's vision of intelligent, economical, and minimally destructive victory remains as revolutionary today as it was 2,500 years ago. Subscribe now, become a member, turn on notifications, share this video with your friends, and leave a comment so we can compare our knowledge and sources. Thank you for following our channel. Until our next strategic journey, here at Warriors of the World.